to vote. So, for example, you had literacy tests. So you had to prove that you were literate if you wanted to vote. If you happened to be a white person, all you'd have to do is to be able to sign your own name. If you're an African American, you'd be asked to recite Shakespeare. You'd have poll taxes, so everyone would have to pay a tax in order to vote. So this kind of is a way of disenfranchising not only poor blacks but also poor whites. You had a grandfather clause in Louisiana, so in order to vote, you had to prove that your own grandfather had voted. Well, guess what? Most African Americans, in fact, virtually all African Americans, did not have grandfathers who were able to vote. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the percentage of African Americans who were actually able to vote had dwindled to a matter of 2 or 3%. If the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision became the landmark case with respect to the segregation of public facilities, the 1890 Mississippi law, the new Constitution of Mississippi, became the example for other states. So one example of another state that developed white supremacist rule in the 1890s is North Carolina. So North Carolina was a state which had a white majority, but there were cities within the state that still had a black majority. So one of those cities was the city of Wilmington. So Wilmington in the 1890s had 55% of its population was black. A lot of them had been freemen who'd moved to the city subsequent to the Civil War in search of economic opportunity. So the city government up until the 1890s had been dominated by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party by the 1870s had wrested control of the state from the Republicans, and they tended to pass policies that served the interests of whites. But Wilmington had an interesting political landscape in the 1890s. So by the 1890s, you had the emergence of what was known as a fusionist government. So fusionist meant a fusion of, on one hand, African Americans who tended to support the Republican Party as the party that had ended slavery, that advocated for the rights of African American citizens, as well as the Populist Party. So the populist movement had emerged in the 1890s in the United States. It was largely an agrarian movement, mostly popular in the West, but also having some foothold in the South. And so the populists in the 1890s, remember the 1890s were a period of profound economic depression. The populists were people who were critical of the power of railroads, critical of the power of banks, critical of the way in which the government had been co-opted by the interests of corporations, by the interest of trusts, by the interest of the financial sector. So the populists were a party that advocated for the interests of small producers against those of monopolies or corporate interests. And by the 1890s, you had actually had a fusionist government that had been elected into power. You had a mayor who was a fusionist. Much of the city council were fusionist in their orientation, and they adopted policies that in many ways undermined the interests of local merchants, of the Democratic elite. And the Democratic elite, as well as a lot of resentful poor whites, were smoldering over the power of the fusionists, which also offered an opportunity for African Americans to have a voice in government. There was still a large number of black voters in North Carolina, and they regularly voted the fusionist ticket. And so in 1898, there was a growing movement in North Carolina for whites to form themselves into organizations that were known as White Government Union, or the White Government Union. And you'll see from this newspaper article from Wilmington in 1898, which lists the principles of the White Government Union. And it says quite avowedly, quite out in the open, the purpose of the organization to be reestablished in North Carolina the supremacy of the white race. And so in the 1898 Wilmington election, there is a concerted effort by the supporters of the White Union and their paramilitary organization, a group of people who are known as the Red Shirts, to reestablish Democratic Party and white-dominated rule in the city. And so, in fact, they engaged in intimidation. They marched through the streets. They threatened to kill or to harm any African American who decides to go to the polls to actually try to vote. But despite all their efforts, despite their attempts to suppress the vote, a fusion ticket actually still manages to secure the majority of the seats in the City Council of Wilmington in the fall of 1898. And so in response to this, the leaders of the Democratic Party, the leaders of the white government union, take to the streets, in fact organize a posse of 2,000 people, 2,000 men armed, who by force surround the city council, they surround the city courthouse, and they start using military force in order to gain control over the city council chambers. Once that's done, they also go out to the streets and start attacking any African American they can see. And so this is a report from Reverend J. Allen Kirk, who was a black minister in Wilmington who witnessed what happened in Wilmington firsthand. He says, "It was a great sight to see them marching from death, and the colored women, colored men, colored children, colored enterprises, and colored people all exposed to death. Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps, and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their dead bodies. A white gentleman said that he saw 10 bodies lying in the undertaker's office at the time. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets until the next day following the riot. Some were found by the stench and miasma that came forth from their decaying bodies under their houses. Every colored man who passed through the streets had either to be guarded by one of the crowd or have a paper or pass giving them the right to pass. All colored men at the cotton press and oil mills were ordered not to leave their labor but stop there while their wives and children were shrieking and crying in the midst of the flying balls and in sight of the cannons and Gatling gun." So by the end of 1898, the possibility of a biracial coalition through the fusionist government of blacks and whites against the Democratic Party had been snuffed through force. And this is kind of something that's replicated over and over and over again in the South, in which military force, in which terrorism is used in order to restrict the rights of African Americans. So by one count, by the estimation of Robert Smalls, who was a congressman from South Carolina, black congressman from South Carolina, some 53,000 African Americans were killed in the 2 decades that followed the end of the Civil War. So think about that. That's 55,000 American dead in Vietnam. We're thinking about the equivalent number of African Americans were killed in political violence following the Civil War in efforts by whites to restrict their right to exercise their political rights. And so this was something that whites were quite open about. So here's a speech that was given by Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who's a senator from South Carolina. He gives a speech on the floor of the United States Senate in 1900, talking about how the rights of African Americans were restricted. He says, "We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal to the white man, and we will not submit to gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him. I would to God the last of them was in Africa, and that none of them had ever been brought to our shores." And so this becomes the law of the land in the South. This becomes the system of white supremacy that exists in the first half of the 20th century until finally it is dismantled, or partially dismantled, with the civil rights movement.